and we're very happy to host this special seminar on the forecast for the 2024 elections. Thank you very much to Professor Simon Hix, who is a professor of comparative politics and European politics here at the European University Institute, who has studied European elections and the European Parliament extensively. Thanks for accepting our invitation and for presenting this forecast. Simon will speak about 35 minutes, and then we go straight to Q&A. We will alternate questions from the room and questions from those who are following online. So I'll give you the floor, Simon.
Thank you very much, Daniele. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you for the invitation. So what I'm going to talk about is forecasts for the European Parliament elections this year, based on some modelling that I've been doing with a colleague in Dublin, Kevin Cunningham. And we're also going to talk about some of what we think the policy and political implications of it are. So I'll first talk about two different ways to forecast the elections. Then I'll show you what Europe Elects currently has. They're the market leader, if you like, in forecasting the elections and the way they do it and what they're predicting. I'll then talk about how our model works and why it is different. I'll then walk through what the actual predictions are. If you go to the European Council on Foreign Relations, you get all the tables by member state. I'm just going to show you some of the headline stuff. And then I'll talk about some of the policy consequences. And some of this is new from work I've been doing with Abdul Nouri. So the first thing to say is there are two main ways to forecast elections. The first one, and particularly European Parliament elections, the first one is what in the field we call nowcast, which is you take current opinion poll standings and you say, if these current opinion poll standings are exactly how the election is going to play out, this is how many seats everybody's going to win. It's called a nowcast because when you ask the voters in the opinion polls, they ask them, how would you vote if an election were held tomorrow? And famously, John Curtis, a British public opinion pollster, says almost all the voters know there isn't an election tomorrow. So actually, what they're answering is something different than if it really was an election. So there's always a bit of error between actually what they say in an opinion poll and really having vote in an election. That error is magnified in European Parliament elections for two reasons. One, these opinion polls themselves are asking about national voting intention. So they're saying, how would you vote in Italy if there was an Italian election held tomorrow? And then they extrapolate from that what the vote would be in a European election. And we know that some voters vote differently in European elections than they do in national elections. And I'll talk about that in a second. The second thing that's different is that we know that even when there's the opinion poll standings, even if we could get really accurate opinion poll measures of how people would vote in a European election, there's a bigger gap between opinion polls and actually voting in European elections than there is between opinion polls and voting in national elections. Part of this is because there's other factors at play in European elections that opinion polls don't capture. So one of them is turnout and turnout differential by party families. So I've been in the business of forecasting European elections for 25 years. The first elections I forecast were in 1999, and then I did those as a nowcast. And then in 2004, I did another one as a nowcast, and Michael Marsh in Dublin said, why the hell are you doing nowcasts? We have all these theories about how European elections work, and you're completely ignoring them. If you're a real political scientist, you'd be taking this seriously. And so I then started co-authoring papers with Michael, predicting how what happens in European Parliament elections. And we have a series of papers where we actually did models that look back and so what are the predictors of what votes parties receive in European elections, testing what was then the standard way of thinking about these elections as what we call second-order national elections. And meaning the first-order election is a national election, European Parliament elections are protest elections against national governments. So big parties lose votes, parties in governments lose votes, and then in a subsequent paper, Michael and I found particular party family effects. And we found two party family effects, in particular Greens. Greens do particularly well in European Parliament elections compared to national elections, and radical right parties do particularly well in European Parliament elections compared to national elections. And there's two reasons why. One is a protest vote. Simply, voters on the left are saying, okay, I'm generally on the left, but I'm not going to vote for the mainstream centre left. I'm going to vote for Green. So it's a kind of protest or signalling of preferences. The same on the right, where you've got voters who would normally vote for the mainstream centre right, and in the European election, they vote for the populist right. And they're signalling they care about immigration issues, or they're signalling to their mainstream right, do not move to centrist, stay on the right. The other effect is a turnout effect. And the turnout effect particularly affects the left, which is that centre-left parties, Social Democrats in particular, do systematically badly in European Parliament elections because their voters stay home. I don't know why, but systematically across Europe, the differential turnout overwhelmingly affects voters on the mainstream centre, parties on the mainstream centre. So from all that sort of modelling of what are the predictors of what actually happens in European Parliament elections, you can actually build a model and predict what's going to happen in the next election, because we know how many votes parties won at the last national election, we know whether they're in government, we know what party family they're from, and so on. So over the years, we've developed and honed this forecasting model, and Michael and I first did it in 2009, and then we did it in 2014, and then in 2019, I did it with Kevin Cunningham and Michael, and then this year it's just me and Kev, because Michael is now retired. So EuropeElects are a free web service that collects opinion poll data from all across Europe, and they do a great job in transmitting this data publicly. You can follow them on their website or on any social media platform, and they now started aggregating this for the European Parliament. So they have an interesting way of doing it. They actually do it in a quite sophisticated way. They have confidence intervals around those national opinion poll standings, and they then extrapolate these up to the European levels. But basically, they take, so if the opinion poll says you've got 20% of the votes, you're going to win approximately 20% of the seats in that member state, depending on the electoral system that is applied in a particular member state. And what they do is the same as us, is we apply exactly the electoral system that exists in every member state when turning the vote share predictions into actual seat forecasts. So this is the current EuropeElects seat forecast that shows, the EPP, largest group, Socialists and Democrats, second largest group, Liberals in the middle there, and a shift in Parliament to the right and a growth in the groups to the right. I'll show you compared to current Parliament in a minute. But it's very small there, but you can see there mainly parties on the left losing votes, parties on the right gaining votes, particularly parties on the radical right. And this is their cross time, so every month they update it and you can follow what they do every month. And actually, as they get closer to the election, our forecast model and their nowcast converge, which we'd expect to happen. So you can see there, they're predicting the EPP to come up relative from a few months ago. Socialists and Democrats still on their way down, and a great big growth in support for parties sitting in the two groups to the right of the EPP, the Identity and Democracy group, which is where Le Pen sits, and the ECR group, which is where Polish Law and Justice and Maloney and co sit. So statistical modelling approach is slightly different. So we take the latest opinion poll standings 6 months ahead of the election, which is where we are now. So we did this for all the opinion polls. We pulled all the opinion polls for December and the first week in January. And we then build a model based on opinion polls in December 2018, January 2019, and then the election in May 2019. And the opinion polls in December 2013, January 2014, and the elections in June 2014. So we pull all the election. So on the left-hand side, the dependent variable is what votes did you get in those elections, in those 2 rounds of European Parliament elections. And on the right-hand side are your opinion poll standings 6 months ahead, whether you're in government, how many votes you got in the previous national election, what's the cycle, what position in the electoral cycle is the European Parliament election going to hold? Because we know in our previous research that the closer you are to your national election, either just after it or just before it, the more you converge back to your national election standing rather than it being an anti-government swing, and also what political family you are. So we built a model, and this time we applied some machine learning to come up with what was the best model prediction of predicting the votes in 2014 and 2019, pooled for those elections. So if the same dynamics are this time round, that's always the problem with forecasting. You build a model, you fit your model to fit the last election, and then this election is not the last election. If it was the last election, it should work really, really well. But we don't know, right? So, you know, things normally kind of even out in the end. But what we get in that model is national opinion polls 6 months before the election predicted what a party got in the European elections by about 78%. So if you took its vote standing in the opinion polls, it's only around 78% predicts what actually is going to happen 6 months later. They revert somewhat back to what their performance was at their previous national election. That's around 13%. And then you get some party family effects. Social Democrats and Liberals are going to do a bit worse. Greens are going to do a bit better. Anti-Europeans are going to do a bit better. Ironically, we found governing parties actually do better in European Parliament elections than they did in their opinion poll standings. So for those of you who are quantitatively minded, this is actually the results of our model, and you can see the R² model fit is pretty large. Up here, you can see it's around 93%. So you throw in everything. It's a forecasting model. You don't care about, and this is not about causation, it's about correlation, and you're trying to maximize the fit. So you can see here that's your current poll standing. You get an estimate of 0.78, so 78% of your current poll standing is predicting what you're going to get in the election, your previous general election, and then your party family effects. Some of those are significant, some of them are not. You can see some of them are larger, some of them are smaller. You can see Social Democrats down 13%. You can see the left down 10%, Liberals down 10%, Greens up 27% on the poll standing. And you can see Eurosceptics up only a little bit because the opinion poll is already capturing a lot of the anti-European swing. Plus, then the bottom there, we've got where you are in the national election cycle. The first one there is, are you a party in government and do you have the prime ministership? And then the number of years out since the last election. Are you a minority party in government plus a number of years out since the election? Are you an opposition party and then the number of years out since the election? So we plug all that in and we say, for every national party, how do you fit? What's your status? What's your opinion poll standing? And we just plug in the model and that predicts exactly a vote share. And so from that predicted vote share, we then calculate how many seats you're likely to win. And from those seats in every member state, we then calculate the party family sizes in the European Parliament. So that's what we get. So then in the middle there, you see the current seats in the European Parliament. There's 705. It's going up to 720. And you can see the current Parliament was already a little bit tilted to the right, but the Liberals in the middle, Liberals here, so this is non-attached. The Liberals are the average member of the current Parliament. And as I'm going to show you, in the current Parliament, you get some coalitions forming to the left, some coalitions forming to the right, and some grand coalitions. In the new Parliament, you're going to see a significant shift rightwards. You're going to see the EPP, now the middle party in the Parliament, and the two big groups to their right, significantly increasing Identity and Democracy, likely to emerge as the third largest group. And if Fidesz, who left EPP and sits in non-attached, then since we published these forecasts a couple of weeks ago, Fidesz have now said that they might go and sit in ECR, which is a bit remarkable when you think that the European Conservative and Reform Group, one of the key parties in there is the Law and Justice Party in Poland. Law and Justice Party hate Putin. Orban loves Putin. They're going to bury the hatchet and sit together in the European Parliament, which would be quite interesting. And part of why they want to do that is there's a real possibility they can become the third largest group in the Parliament. But for the first time, we're going to see these two groups to the right in combination being the largest bloc in the European Parliament, around 25% of the seats. So here's a comparison between our forecast and the nowcast from EuropeElects. It's a sort of face validity check, if you like. The Hix-Cunningham one is in orange here, EuropeElects is in green, current Parliament's in stripes. And you can see, it's not that different to the current status. We're both predicting the Liberals are going to lose, Greens are going to lose, but we predict the Greens not to lose quite as much because we're factoring in the fact Greens doing a bit better in European elections. We're predicting the radical right to do slightly better than they are. Again, European election effect. We're predicting the EPP and the Socialists to be down a little bit more than they're projecting. But otherwise, it's pretty similar. So with the effects that they're predicting, in a sense, we're magnifying. Our forecast model is magnifying the effects that are already happening. So then we start to move on to think about, well, so what? Why does this matter? How is this going to change anything? And one way to think about that is, what are the coalitions that form? And unlike in national parliaments, there's not an inbuilt coalition in the European Parliament. So a particular coalition comes together for every single vote. So voting in the European Parliament is much more like US Congress than it is in national parliaments in Europe. And so different coalitions form on different policy issues. And to start with, one of the first votes will be a vote on electing the next Commission President. The coalition that came together to elect von der Leyen was the Socialists, the EPP and the Liberals together in the middle of the Parliament. And then when it came to voting on the Commission as a whole, the Greens also joined that coalition. So you essentially had four groups in the Parliament voting together to back the Commission. But on other types of legislation, as I'm going to show in a minute, different types of coalitions form. And so how large are those blocks in the European Parliament? So the Grand Coalition in the last election lost its majority of seats for the first time. So before the 2019 election, EPP and S&D together, if they did business together, they could pretty much deliver a majority in the Parliament. Then it fell, and it's going to fall even further. Then it fell, and then they essentially formed what we call these days a super grand coalition, the two largest parties plus the Liberals in the middle, and they will fall as well. They'll still have 50% of the seats. They'll have 54% around about. It could get worse. They could get close to 50%. But even with that percentage of seats, there's turnout differential. There is not 100% cohesion of those parties. So even if those three vote together, there's a good chance for some votes they could lose. Then we move to the sort of the split blocks between left and right, where you have S&D voting against EPP. Sometimes you get a left block forming, sometimes you get a right block forming. And so you can see how left block, if you take S&D, Greens and the left, that will be down to just over 30% of the votes. If you take the centre-left block, which is the left block joined by the Liberals in the middle, that for the first time, that's going to be well below 50%. So currently, on some key policy issues, which we'll talk about in a minute, the centre-left governs in the European Parliament, particularly on environment. So on environment, you get some of those non-attached, and even some EPP members, particularly the Scandinavian EPP members and the Irish Fine Gael, splitting from EPP and voting with the left. Even with those Scandis and the Irish Liberals, Irish Conservatives splitting from the EPP and voting with the left, they won't have a majority of seats for the first time. The centre-right, ECR plus EPP plus Liberals, which often votes together on free market questions, they won't have 50%, but it'll be close. And you can see this populist right block of EPP plus these parties to their right will get close to 50%. And if you add Fidesz, they're over 50%. So we're going to have EPP plus ECR plus ID plus Fidesz will have a majority of seats in the European Parliament for the first time. This will be the most right-wing European Parliament ever in the history of the European Parliament since the 1950s. And there's the Euro critics, the Eurosceptics. Of course, there's some uncertainty about group membership. The three big uncertain ones I've mentioned. One of them, the three big uncertain ones are Fratelli d'Italia, Fidesz, and Five Star. Fratelli d'Italia, currently in ECR, there's been some discussion about whether EPP would like her to join them. I don't think actually that's going to happen, because I don't think it's really in her interests. She's going to find herself as the big player in one of the groups that's now pivotal in the Parliament. Why would she want to join the EPP, which is defining? I think she'll have more power outside negotiating with EPP inside EPP, but we'll have to wait and see. EPP want that because sounds like people in Brussels.
No, ti ho chiamato a pranzo, non so.
So EPP may want that because Fratelli d'Italia are declining fast.
Da quegli altri, andiamo per l'altro è meglio, c'è più scelta, dai.
Possiamo buttare poi questo, o silenziare.
Forza Italia are going to lose a lot of seats, and so EPP like to have a major party on the centre-right in every member state. And so she's the biggest centre-right party or right-wing party in Italy. It would be a nice strategy for the EPP to have. But that's not clear. Fidesz in Hungary, as I mentioned, might join ECR. In fact, that's probably likely. A 5-star currently in non-attached. We don't know where they'll go. If you look at them ideologically, they would fit either in the Greens or in the left, but they're a very big party. And so political groups often, the big players in those groups often don't like other big parties joining because they feel like they already run the show and they don't want these guys to come in and run the show. So the German Greens would be a bit reluctant to have 5-star in the Greens, and some of the left-wing parties would be reluctant. So we don't know where they're going, but there's some uncertainty. But most of the uncertainty is on the right in the Parliament, whether some of these national parties down here are going to sit in the non-attached or in the ECR or in the EPP. We just don't know. What we expect, if you go member state by member state, is a major breakthrough for the populist right across Europe. In a sense, we've seen the populist right growing in lots of countries in Europe, and all of this is like a perfect storm for them to come together in these European Parliament elections and do well in a whole range of countries across Europe. So you can see, there you can see the vote share in 2019 is shaded, and 2024 in our model. So Fidesz will go down, but still have a lot of votes. You can see the populist right in our model would come top of the polls in 9 of the 27 member states, come second or third in another 9 member states. Denmark, the only member state where there will be a significant drop in support for the populist right, where the Danish People's Party are really losing support domestically. So one way to think about this is for the last 2 elections, when we've done our forecasts, the story has been a rise in support for the radical right. And again, we're seeing rise in support for the radical right. So what's different about this time? I think what's different is they start to cross a threshold where they're no longer rising, they have risen. And we've seen that at the national level in lots of countries, where they reach a point where it's very difficult to do business without them. They start to become a party, a coalitionable party, or a major party of government, as we've seen in Central Eastern Europe and we've seen in Italy. But in the Netherlands now, Wilders, it's very, very difficult to form a government without Wilders. The key party to watch, I think, is the German CDU and their reactions to AfD, and whether or not we will see the CDU or some wing of the CDU saying we have to do business with the AfD and the end of the Colonne Sanitaire, and particularly depending on what happens in Land elections in East Germany this year, if the AfD emerge as the largest party in several of these Land elections, can you form a government without them, and so on, and what does that mean? And so if the CDU at any point then decide to do some kind of business with them, whether they form a minority with AfD support in some of these Länder, that I think will not just only have resonance in Brussels, it'll have resonance also in Berlin, rather, it'll have resonance in Brussels on the strategy of the EPP in the European Parliament. So this then links nicely to thinking about which way do the EPP swing? Do they swing to the centre or do they swing to the right? And currently, you can look at the type of coalitions that form in the current parliament, and this is from work by myself and Abdul Nouri, looking at all the votes in the current parliament. I'm going to show you some voting patterns. In general, voting coalitions in the parliament are pretty stable and have been stable for about 15 years. So you tend to see a grand coalition on some issues, mainly foreign policy issues, economic and monetary union, international trade. You tend to see a centre-left coalition on civil liberties and justice and home affairs, so the whole migration agenda, environment policy, social policy, gender equality. You tend to see a centre-right coalition on industry and research, agriculture, regulation of the internal market as well. So these are the general coalition patterns in the parliament. So I don't know if you can see the numbers here, but it's shaded to give you an idea. So every group is lined up here, left to right. And you can see the shaded cells here. The numbers in the cells are the percentage of time that the plurality in a group votes the same way as the plurality in another group. Remember, it's not just majority, so you vote yes, no, or abstain. So you take the plurality of a group in a vote and say, did they vote the same way as the plurality in this other group? The baseline, of course, is very high because there's lots of pretty highly consensual votes, because there are things like, you know, do we go home early today? They all vote. So you can see the broad patterns here. So if you look at the EPP, S&D, around 73% of the time they vote the same way. EPP votes 80% of the time with the Liberals. Liberals also vote 87% of the time with the Socialists and Democrats. So you can see actually, because the Liberals swing either with the EPP or with the S&D. You can see the colours changing as I scroll through here. This is foreign affairs. In foreign affairs, you can see this grand coalition in the middle of the parliament. Very high percentage of votes here. It's these three groups in the middle, the Renew Europe, EPP and S&D all voting the same way, all voting together, voting as a bloc and winning most of them, and actually increasingly also voting with the Greens on a lot of issues. International trade, again, you can see this big bloc in the European Parliament, in the centre of the Parliament, but this time the centrist bloc adds the ECR rather than adding the Greens. So in international trade, you see the centrist bloc, but it's leaning slightly to the right as opposed to slightly to the left. Environment, you can see 2004 recorded votes on environment, by far the most active policy area in the EU and by far the most active policy area in the European Parliament. This is the period of the EU Green Deal. I'll come back to a very tight vote. And you can clearly see this centre-left bloc. S&D, so Liberals voting with 90% of the time with S&D, and then Liberals voting 77% of the time with the left. In fact, Liberals voting more with the left on environment issues than they vote with EPP. You can see the same on civil liberties, justice and home affairs. Again, this big centre-left bloc. And if we scroll down to internal market, you start to see a centre-right bloc of the Liberals voting with the EPP and with ECR. And then agriculture, you can see an even more right-wing bloc. So you can see how the colours change. I don't know how much time it took me to line up the damn graphs, but anyway. A nice illustration of this is the nature restoration law. So this was a proposal to reject the nature restoration law on the 12th of July 2023. EPP, so the Commission proposed as part of its Green Deal, EU Green Deal, to pass quite an ambitious nature restoration law, backed very much by the centre-left and the Greens in the European Parliament. The EPP at the last minute split and said, we think this is too ambitious. They were being heavily lobbied by agriculture and by industry. And at the last minute, they made a proposal to the floor to reject the Commission proposal outright and to kill legislation dead. And it snuck through by 324 votes to 312. And that was the vote split. So you can see the left bloc here, Liberals, 27 Liberals voted to reject the legislation. That's the EPP. 15 EPP members voted to keep the legislation. That was mainly Fine Gael and some of the Scandinavians. And you can see this sort of right-wing bloc against the left-wing bloc here. Clearly a left-right split with the Liberals mostly voting with the left, and it just passed. So now you can rerun that vote. And the way we rerun that vote is to take every national delegation and say, how did that national delegation? So how did the Germans in the SPD, or how did the French in the EPP, or how did the Italians in the Greens, you know, whatever. So we take, how did they vote in that vote? Were they voting all one way or another way, or were they split? And then we just change the size of that national delegation based on our forecast of how many seats they're going to get. And then we rerun it and we get this. This is what would have happened in the vote. It would have been rejected. So we're going to, that really kind of concretely shows how the shift in the European Parliament shift much more to quite a green skeptic, not climate skeptic per se, but more resistant to ambitious EU agenda. This fits very much with what we're seeing in a lot of member states with the farmers on the streets and the radical right shifting to originally being a party that parties across Europe that were very opposed to immigration to now being parties across Europe that are opposed to immigration and sceptical on environment questions as well. So they've added that to their mix. So in sum, I think the European Parliament elections are going to see a major shift to the right to produce the most right-wing European Parliament we've ever seen. I might be wrong. This is just a forecast, but the forecast is consistent with the nowcast. It's not that different. It magnifies some of those effects. The median MEP is going to be in the EPP for the first time. That's important because of the fact the median MEP is almost always on the winning side of you, either in the grand coalition or centre-left majority or centre-right majority. And that median MEP is going to be in the EPP. We're going to see a breakthrough for the groups to the right. Either ID or ECR are going to be the third largest group in the Parliament. If Fidesz join ECR, it'll probably be ECR, with ID the fourth largest group. And together they'll have more seats than EPP or S&D. It's unlikely that they're going to do a deal and get together. A populist right bloc of the EPP voting with these guys on the right, including with Fidesz, would have a majority of seats for the first time. I understand there's a lot of people on the line from Brussels that I'm going to immediately get people saying, this will never happen, the EPP will never vote with these guys. So just, that's going to happen, okay? I mean, they won't vote with them. They might not vote with them, but people are going to protest. This could have major policy implications. And how do we think about that? You think about what are the current coalitions that form, how big are those coalitions? And I think the current set of policy areas where you get a centre-left majority, particularly on environment, are the most vulnerable to change. So foreign affairs, probably not much change. Ukraine, actually, there's still a big majority in the European Parliament in favour of EU strategy and NATO strategy on Ukraine. That's unlikely to change. There's big heterogeneity in opinions of these people on the right when it comes to European policy towards Ukraine. I think the area that's most likely to change is environment policy. And so I think we could see quite a shift in the agenda going forward. And of course, the first thing that happens is going back to where I started, election of the Commission President. So von der Leyen is probably going to announce very soon that she wants to stand for re-election. She will then get the Spitzenkandidat or lead candidate modelled by default, because she becomes the lead candidate of the EPP. EPP probably going to emerge as the largest group. The governments will probably then back her. Is she going to be elected in the Parliament? Is the same coalition going to support her? Are the socialists and the liberals going to back her if they think that she's now backpedaling on the environment agenda? What have we seen? We've seen farmers on the streets, and we've seen immediately her backpedaling, saying, whoa, actually, no, we'll change the rules because we don't want to punish the farmers. So immediately she's shifting on environment in the direction of the protesters. So I think it's not a foregone conclusion that it's going to be a very easy ride for her through to get a majority in the European Parliament. And I think a lot of it will be dependent on what she sets out as a policy agenda, what sort of roles she might give to Socialists and Democrats, what other jobs are going to be handed out amongst the European top jobs as part of the package deal, and what kind of things is the European Parliament going to give these groups on the right? ECR up to now have been inside the tent. ID has been outside the tent or beyond the cordon sanitaire when it comes to committee assignments. Are we going to see that change, particularly if those two groups start to coordinate with each other? That's all I got. Thanks.